Karen and others to come in and kind of facilitate some transition into the next layer of work based on where you've been and the work that you've done, where are you, and then what is your next level of work to achieve the outcomes you seek to achieve. So that's what we're going to do over the next couple of hours. I am here with my partner, Sherry Gibson, and we are with Strategic Innovations Group. A little bit about us. I am a practitioner first and a consultant, coach, trainer second. What that means is, for a couple of decades, I was in the field working to achieve outcomes very similar to the outcomes that you guys are seeking to achieve. And in my work and all of my experience, I had the opportunity to go out on the road. And in 2012, I slept in 22 states. And because I'm a firm believer in being on the ground in communities to work over some of the humps and the challenges that people and collective groups of representatives and partners, the challenges that we're trying to overcome. There's not a textbook answer on how to do that. We got to be on the ground, we got to be working through this, get our hands dirty. Sherry and I have spent a great deal of time over the last couple of months getting our hands dirty in your data, understanding where you've been, what kind of conclusions you've drawn, what kind of questions you have at this point. And so my work now is working with communities across the country. I had the honor and the privilege to be president and CEO of the Coalition for a Drug-Free Greater Cincinnati in Southwest Ohio. The founder of that group and my board president was then Congressman, now Senator Portman. And we were instrumental in the development and the creation of the Drug-Free Communities Grant Program. Anybody familiar with that? The Drug-Free Communities Grant Program comes out of the Executive Office of the President, and is funded through SAMHSA, Substance Abuse Mental Health Services Administration, and it provides funding to communities across the country to do work very similar to what you're doing. So coming out of that position and my work with Senator Portman, that led us into being in a space where we get to go out and work with other communities to do this kind of work, figure out how do we work together to achieve outcomes. So a little bit about myself, but that's enough. Sherry is interestingly, a retired senior executive in the banking industry. And she left the banking industry and was very interested in working with nonprofits, took on an executive director leadership role, worked with other nonprofit leaders, became a coach for nonprofit leaders on managing the business and business development for nonprofit organizations. So our efforts working together is how do we use the resources that we have available to us in new and innovative ways to meet the growing, emerging, constantly changing needs of our community. So that's where Strategic Innovations comes from. Me as a practitioner, Sherry as a banker, and how do we work with nonprofits and communities to do what it is that they're trying to do. So I am very pleased and excited to be here today to work through this next level of work. We'll be here this morning and then back again this afternoon to work with system leaders and other partners in a more abbreviated session this afternoon. Before we get into this, because I can talk for 26 hours at least about everything that I want to talk about today, but that has zero value if it's not meeting your needs and what it is that you all need. So I'd like to take just a few minutes to hear from you. Some of you have been here since the beginning. Some of you it's your first meeting, you're just now joining. Some of you are here at the beginning and then stepped out, stepping back in. So I am very curious to hear from folks at the table. Why are you here? What do you perceive the purpose of this work to be? So, why are you here? Somebody share.
Save a life.
Okay, save a life. Tell me a little bit more about that. What do you mean by that?
My first year last year, we had 2 suicides. This is year 24 for me. First 2 I've had.
First 2 in 24 years?
Yeah.
Wow.
And so, too many.
Too many, you're absolutely right. Looking at maybe some of the underlying causes and risk factors and how can we address those. I see some head shaking on that. All right, perfect. Somebody else, why are you here?
My hope is that we can be focused about interventions we put in our schools. Like right now, we just put, so we've had 2 suicides, and typically everyone would come in and say, oh, we can help, and then they come in and then they leave. But I want some real purposeful, focused interventions to help our kids. I want to know what our kids need. Sometimes as adults, we're like a decade behind.
Right.
We think they need something, and they've already moved on.
Yes.
So And we can no longer afford to do that.
Exactly, and as fast-paced and constantly changing as the young people's world is, it's not even about being a decade behind now, it's almost being a month behind, right? Because it's so constant and so changing. And how do we still stay relevant and meet the needs of our young people? And be strategic about that. Free is not always better, right? And just because somebody's coming in and offering to do 1,000 things. I work with a school within the urban core of Cincinnati, and we're addressing childhood trauma with very young children, with kindergartners and first graders. 54% of the kindergartners and first graders that we assessed positive for PTSD related to the trauma that they're experiencing in their lives. It's pretty a profound project. But the interesting thing and what's relevant to this conversation is that we did an inventory of the services and supports that have been offered to that school, and there were potentially 764 partners. Now, it's a very urban school, but everybody from Toyota to the nonprofit sector to Procter & Gamble to Family Trust wanted to come in and do programs in this school. And so it was this chasing of squirrels and provision of programs that just wasn't getting them anywhere. So part of our work was, let's strategically understand first what are the issues that the kids are facing and what it looks like, and then understand what are the supports that are being offered, and how do we align those supports to the outcomes that we want to achieve. So I think your expectation and your hope is very realistic for what can happen in this kind of space. Good. Somebody else, why are you here?
I feel like I was piggybacking off the other two accounts, but we had our first suicide 2 weeks ago, and we had an attempt earlier in the year, actually in the classroom of a kid.
Wow.
And the number of kids who are emotionally and socially disconnected is alarming, and as Donna mentioned, it's hard to understand being a kid if you were a kid 10 or 15 years ago, because it's so different. Things change so much.
Success or accomplishment for you all as a group thus far?
So I'm proud of the fact that a year and a half later, we are still meeting, because that's how important this is. And that sounds like a trite statement, but typically, we are all busy school educators, and and the fact that people keep coming to the table is huge. And you can't underestimate how huge that is, that this work group continues to meet, because people feel it's that important.
Fantastic. Other accomplishments or significant achievements for this group? Been here for a year. What do you feel like you've gotten done? Yes?
Well, I think it's an achievement just in itself. I think Karen has done a great job of making sure that there's constant progress, and that every meeting has a purpose, has a goal, and then there's an achievement. And I think with a group that size, that's difficult typically, but I think she's done a nice job of keeping everybody on track and keeping that momentum going.
Good. Critical, right? And why do people keep meeting month after month and feel good about that? Because there's movement, right? We're moving, we see things happening. Any other significant accomplishments or contributions from this group? Yes?
I think that I'm really impressed with the fact that we have young people that are sitting on here, and we're actually listening to what they have to say. Because in other organizations or other groups that have done this, I've not really heard of young people being on the team.
Yes. Yes, and the youth voice is an equal partner, right? There's equity. It's not a token kind of thing, but we want to hear, we want to listen, we want to work across partners, and that's all partners, including youth. Good. Any other significant accomplishments or achievements?
We ran the pilot to run the asset survey at 2 schools, so at 2 grade levels, or same grade level, 2 schools, but I think that was an accomplishment, because now we have something we can look at, talk about, figure out, decide how to proceed.
Significant. What about challenges? What would you say or identify as challenges that this group has faced or is currently facing? Well, that's good.
Well, I think they're coming. I think we did 2 grade levels, but I mean, there's always that, are we going to get good data? There's always, once the community knows who's involved, like they don't want, there's always that, I don't want my kids taking this survey. There's always, we'll see how schools use it, like we have an intended purpose. Well, so I think maybe the challenges are coming, this has been, we've all kind of been on the same page for right now, but as we kind of move to the full implementation, I have a feeling we'll have some
Potential challenge ahead, right? Absolutely. Any other challenges you would identify for this group at this point? Yeah?
I think it's the unknown, because like some folks were mentioning, this is a constantly moving target. What we can figure out and bring together today isn't going to be right 5 minutes from now. It's hopefully, like Ms. Cook mentioned, that we just keep at it. You know,
Mhm.
I'm very impressed about the group of folks around the table. It's a lot of good dedication.
Yes, very dedicated. And the fact that it's constantly moving is both a challenge and an opportunity, right? Studying and working with groups all over the country. I've worked in 46 states out of the 50. All communities all over the country. We fail when we stop moving, right? When the target becomes so stagnant that it doesn't allow for ideas and solutions and innovations to emerge from the collective group, right? So it's a challenge because it is constantly moving, we're constantly adding, but it's also the biggest opportunity, and that opportunity that gives these kind of groups life. Because we can't just say, here's the complete definition of the problem, here's the complete solution, now we're done, right? All right, any other challenges that you perceive or anticipate for this work, for this group? Okay? All right, so thank you for taking the time to do that, because it's important for me to understand a little bit about where you are as a group, where you've been, why you're here, what motivates you, and to understand about where we go next. So we're going to do a couple of things today. The first thing is I'm going to give you just a high-level summary interpretation of the data that you collected through the Asset Development Survey and the Developmental Relationships Inventory. So we're going to take a few minutes and go through that just so we have a common understanding and agreement among partners and across partners about what we learned from that data. So we'll take a few minutes, do a high-level understanding of that data, and then we're going to lay that into what does that mean for us? What are the conclusions that we draw from that data? And how does that create a roadmap for where we go next? So we'll spend some time organizing the data findings into a logical approach for our work. And then at the end of our time, a bulk of our time, but at the end, we'll begin to talk about how do we create some measurements and benchmarks for how we know whether or not we're making progress. Because I believe it's a disservice to our kids and to our communities if we're only measuring our progress every 2 years or every 4 years or every 6 years. Because the lives of our children, of our young people in our families is very constant. We realize that with just the experience of 2 suicides last week. We can't wait for 2 years to know whether or not what we're doing is making a difference. So how are we measuring in the short term? How are we going to gauge? How are we going to know whether or not we're making progress? How are we going to know in the intermediate? And how are we going to know in the long term whether or not we're making progress? So we're going to spend some time understanding what are those benchmarks and how do we measure those over time. Does that sound good? Review the data. What does that mean for our approach to addressing needs in the community? And then how do we measure that so we know we're making progress over time? Fair? All right, so let's get started. First of all, there's some differences between your PowerPoint and what you're going to see on the slide. I want to acknowledge that at the beginning, but I didn't want to pick these back up because there's a very important slide in there that I want you to be able to have. So I would encourage you to work from here at the beginning until we get to this slide. I will email where we landed with the PowerPoint slides to Karen, and she can send that out to everybody so that you have the most recent version. So let's start with what is the coalition theory of change, right? If you're a collective group of partners and you're agreeing to work together to achieve shared outcomes, how do you do that? So this theory of change, well, this is the world's worst slide, right? Anybody who does public speaking or teaching knows you don't put this much on a slide, right? But it's an important slide because it puts it all together in one place. Here's what it says. It says we're going to do an assessment. We're going to collect some data to understand the issues that we're addressing. And then we're going to draw conclusions from that issue to create a logical approach to our work. if we implement the logical approach to our work, we will achieve short-term, intermediate, and long-term outcomes. And if we achieve those outcomes, we will increase positive outcomes for you. Okay? We're going to collect our data, lay it into a logical approach, measure whether or not we're making a difference, and if we do all of that, we will increase overall positive outcomes for you. What's critically important here is that this purple section here is the strategies, where we talk about what are the programs and services that we're going to provide. We've talked about chasing squirrels and just doing a whole lot of programs and services. My challenge to communities is, are you being busy or are you being effective? Because those are two totally different places. We can do a lot of things and be really, really busy, but we're not necessarily achieving the outcomes that we want to achieve. What's critical and what this slide shows us is that we're making database decisions, organizing approach to our work, but we're aligning programs and strategies to the short-term outcomes that we want to achieve. So a critical question when we choose programs and strategies is, why are we doing this program and what outcome are we seeking to achieve? We also see here that there's multiple strategies aimed at the short-term outcome, because no single strategy is going to achieve the outcome that we seek to achieve, right? It takes multiple strategies across multiple partners. Part of the work that is necessary for this group, and a lot of what we'll be doing today, is identifying what are those short-term outcomes, and then what role do you play? What role do you play? What role do you play? We all need to do what we're doing aimed at a shared outcome, right? So we're not just doing programs trying to decrease problem behaviors. We're defining our short-term outcomes and we're aligning our strategies to those outcomes. That's the theory of change for how this kind of work happens. So let's get there for your community. Design thinking to achieve collective impact. How do we get there? First, we develop a deep understanding of the problem. We can't just say, all right, we have 40% of kids who are reporting that, yes, I think about suicide. That's not deep enough of an understanding. We need to understand the risk factors. We need to understand the environment within which these kids are experiencing these feelings, these emotions. What are the contributing factors to why this is happening? Do we have populations of students where we see it more often than other populations of students? We need to understand very deeply the issue that we're trying to change. We need to clearly articulate the problem that we're trying to solve. That's drawing this picture that I talked about. Then we need to think about and brainstorm potential solutions and select and develop the solutions. Solutions with an S, not a single solution. Then we need to design a series or prototype a series of solutions, and then we need to go out and test them. This is really important for communities because a lot of times we get stuck in, these are the programs that we do, and these are the programs we're always going to do, right? Instead of saying, let's go out and let's try this series of programs and services on. Let's do it from prevention, intervention, and crisis response, not just one of those three, but across the continuum of care, what are the programs and services that we're going to do? Let's organize those, and let's define those, and then let's go out and do those. An example that I have a dry erase marker. An example that's relevant in many communities that I want to share right now is that we learned something in communities, not necessarily school-based, but we know that in communities across the country, people are dying from opiate overdose deaths, right? We learned that. We now know lots of things about that. So as a community, we said, let's get people together. Based on what we know, people are dying. Let's get people together and communicate, talk about it. Let's convene our partners. So we got partners together in communities, and then we started getting lots of money related to that. Lots of funding came out. So then we said, let's figure out what we're going to do about it. And let's try it. So we went out into communities and we tried it. Think about what you've read and what you know about the opiate problem in communities across the country. People are dying. So we got people together and we said we're going to talk about it. And then we said, okay, what are we going to do about it? What's the first thing that communities across the country decided to do about the opiate problem? Anybody know? Put Narcan into the hands of all the first responders, right? I see head shaking and people smiling. Everybody's gonna have Narcan. What happened when we started giving people Narcan?
That's one down.
Deaths went down, absolutely. What else happened?
Use one up.
We Narcaned the same people 8 times, 10 times. Instead of giving people 1 shot, we were giving people 10 shots, 12 shots. We learned that when we give people Narcan, it resets the body. And so when the next time you use heroin, it's almost like the first time that you used heroin. So we found out that we learned that people who were addicted to opiates were seeking Narcan shots so they could reset their body to re-experience that high. We learned from that experience that our systems, our law enforcement, our first responders could not afford Narcan. They were using too much. It was blowing their budgets, right? We learned that many of the people who were getting Narcan had children. Those children were in traumatic situations that were showing up in school. We learned that we had a half a generation of kids that are now being raised in kinship care by grandparents, by aunts, by uncles. But as a community, in communities across the country, what happened is people are dying. Let's get together and talk about it. What are we going to do? We're going to equip Narcan, all the first responders with Narcan, and we're just going to keep doing that. And we fell off the rails, and the problem, while we reduced overdose deaths, all the ancillary problems continued. What this says is that we're going to understand the problem, create some solutions, go out and test the solution, but we have to close the loop. We have to come back to these kind of groups and say, based on what we tried, is it working or is it not working? Instead of just saying we're going to keep Narcanning people and hope this problem goes away. So we need to come back together as a group and say, is it working? Yes, it's working. We had to reduce the deaths. However, we have kids involved. Those kids are showing up in public systems, and they're showing up at school, and they're very trauma impacted. We can't afford it. First responders, what happens when we Narcan the same person 3 times? So when we put the example of, let's say, youth are experiencing high levels of anxiety, then what we're saying needs to happen is we need to understand what is causing that anxiety and what are the contributions. At the same time, what are the indicators for prevention? What are the protective factors that we can put into place? So we need to understand that with data, the issue of anxiety, and then we come together as a community, a group of partners like you all, and you say, based on what we know from the data, what are potential solutions and how do we create a comprehensive set of solutions? Let's go out and try them. When we try them, what did we learn? What's working? Well, we're seeing some decreases in this area, but increases in this area. We're seeing that our programs and services are effective with most kids, but those kids who have an incarcerated parent, it's not working in that place, those sorts of things. So we come back together in a group and say, is it working, is it not working? What do we do next? Let's talk about it, let's create potential solutions, let's try them out, let's learn something. And that's what this group is doing. It's creating this feedback loop so that we're not just saying, let's create a program and just keep doing that program. We're saying we're going to stay together as a group, use our data, draft solutions, try out solutions, learn from it, draft solutions, try out solutions, and learn from it. Does that make sense? So we think about how this group works. It's data-based. We understand the problem from data and from experience, but we can't just start throwing solutions at the problem and think it's going to get better. So let's understand your data. I know that you guys spent time looking at your data when you got it back from the Search Institute. So, we won't spend a lot of time here, but it's important to make sure that we're all having the same understanding and the same vision of what this data is telling us. The composite asset score, there's 40 developmental assets. The survey goes in and looks at, do we see kids that have high numbers of these assets? Do we see kids who don't? Overall, 60% of your youth are adequate or thriving. So when we look at this chart, purple and green. 60% of your youth say that they have an adequate number of assets, or the number of assets sets them up to be thriving in their lives. Lots of protective factors in their life. That's really, really good news. And there are many communities that would be very envious of that. However, 41% of youth fall into the red and the orange container, where they are challenged or vulnerable. So you have good news and you have reason to celebrate, but you also have necessity for this kind of work. Any reaction or response to that? Agree? Disagree? Any interpretation? I see head shaking, so we see some agreement. Is it surprising?
Not really, to me anyway. I would, is this off the 2 surveys of the 2 districts?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
And this is combined of the two?
Yes. Yes. So you're not surprised? All right, good. So we'll keep going. So when we understand those assets, asset data is really complicated because they don't measure, do you have asset number 1? Do you have asset number 2? Do you have asset number 3, right? That's not how they measure and give you the data, which makes it a little complicated and a little challenging. They look at it from the contexts and the categories of assets. Context looks at in the environments, the ecology, if you will, of a child's life. What are the environments that they exist in? And that's the personal assets, those that look at internal strengths that shape the character of young people, including their self-concept, their values, their attitudes, and their capabilities. So one of the contexts is my own personal assets. The second context is social assets. How do I interact with other people, with my peers, with adults in the community, with system leaders and faith leaders? So my interaction with other people is one of the other contexts. Then we have the family assets. How do I experience and receive and build assets in the family context? And the school context, assets that are experienced and built in the school. And then we have the community assets, assets that are experienced and built in community settings. What's really important to understand, and for me the importance for this group, is that we can't just intervene in one of these areas. We have to intervene across the lifespan, across the reality of where our young people exist. And I think sometimes we get very stuck in the school space because that's where kids are captured. And a lot of times it's where we collect data because kids are collected in a school building. It's easy to collect data, right? But when we think about how we're going to respond, if we're only intervening in one of these areas, we have less likelihood that we're going to have kids who are thriving. We have to intervene across the board. The other thing that the context allows us to do is that it looks at the relationships that young people have with people in all aspects and facets of their life. And that'll be important when we move on a little bit further. When we look a little deeper in the contexts, and we say, okay, where do kids in Geauga County score high in terms of thriving? In the context, we see that in the social, the family, and the school, you have very strong assets, asset-rich environments, or asset-rich context. Where they struggle is in the personal and the community. So from a personal perspective, the internal strengths that shape the character of young people, including their self-concept, values, attitudes, and capabilities. So some of their sense of self, some of their sense of personal capacity and personal efficacy, being their own personal champion, some of those pieces are where the young people report through this asset survey that they're struggling. And the other place is in the community. So outside of school and outside of family, do I feel like I belong? Do I feel like I'm valued? What are my opportunities? Is this surprising to anyone?
Yes.
How so?
Well, I put a little note on my paper, when we talk about context, the 5 areas, I think we as, everyone here is school people, we as school people feel like we could probably, or I know that I feel like I can impact most of these areas, with the exception of we struggle always getting the family involved. You know, that's our big struggle, trying to get the family involved. And I believe when I look at this and the kids who have lower scores in the personal community, I think that sense of self is learned at home. So I think there's like a little disconnect, because I feel like if that's the one area that we can't impact as well, is
Okay.
family.
Okay.
And so those kids, if I'm going back to the other slide, that those 41%, you know, I think that we do our best to impact what we can at school and out in the, you know, but I feel like that's where we struggle. Probably everyone here says, it's the same kids and we can't get those families in, and if we could just get those families, I mean, we've all said that, you know, like when we have things at school that we think will help, you know, the people that show up are not the people that we, you know, we need there. So
Yes.
that's surprising that it's, most people are reporting families the highest, when I would think that would be our biggest challenge.
But you'll see that a lot. I've done politics for a lot of years. You'll see the same thing. Everybody loves their congressman. They hate Congress.
Right.
You don't want to talk bad about your own family in front of other
Right.
people, no matter
Right,
how
so I'm just saying, that's
quasi-indeed it
the
is.
challenge, that's the challenge.
Well, the other part about it is, you know, if you look at the overall numbers, 60% shows strong, which doesn't surprise me. I mean, if you look at it, it's the same 20 to 30 kids probably, I know in my building, that are the ones I worry about. I mean, it's not like it's everybody that's there. It's 10% of the kids really are the ones that are, I'm sure there's others I don't know, but, so it doesn't surprise me. The question would be those other ones that are in the critical area, what they're, I don't know if it's broken down that way, but, you know, what are those ones who don't feel connection, don't have the assets, what are their numbers look like? Because I imagine it looks a lot different than that.
Okay. Any other reactions? Yes.
Well, I mean, sort of along what he was saying, I mean, I remember last time sort of talking to that even though they're claiming family as the highest, is their family really that healthy support for them? Like, is the family a really strong unit? Or, like you said, is it just, well, I'm not gonna talk bad about my family, but my family really is very dysfunctional and causes a lot more sort of trauma and anxiety than I'm willing to acknowledge. And the other thing we had talked about too is really, even though we have several adequate sections, like where are we on that continuum? Are we closer to thriving in the adequate, or are we closer to the vulnerable section? Because it's, you know, like, where are we in that? Like, because I feel like we're saying, oh yeah, these are really like positives, and it is, but are we positive, like almost really positive, or are we just barely positive?
All right, so her question, and I don't know if we can answer that, it's a very interesting question. Where were we with the?
Adequate.
Yes, of the adequate, shoot, hold on, bear with me. Of the 38%, no, sorry, of the 51% that are adequate, are they scoring highly adequate or barely adequate?
Is it high C or low C? Yeah.
There you go, right? Is it a high C or a low C? And I don't know if we can tell that from the report, but Sherry will take a look at that as we continue.
Think about it first.
Any other reactions? I think this conversation is significant in setting you up for the strategies discussion about what are we going to do about the problems, because we can't just build in any one of these. I've worked with young people early in my career, children of chemically dependent parents. I had a young man who was in foster care, was doing support groups for kids who were removed from the home because of an addictive parent. And this young man could not wait to be returned to his mother. And he was removed from the home because she stabbed him in the chest while she was freaking out on crack. And he couldn't wait to get back home. So whoever's point it was about, do I feel supported, do I feel like I'm a part of my family, we can't just rely on that as the only strength in our community, because there may be dysfunctions within that family, right? I feel valued, but I'm valued within that dysfunction, right? So the importance of this data is that exactly. We can't only intervene or understand or build assets in one of these areas. We have to build across the board. So again, when we think about programs and strategies and supports and what are we going to do about it, we have to look across the board. We can't just intervene at an individual level. The other thing that's really important is to understand the complexity of the issue that we're facing. And this is another place where I see communities really struggle, where we have less complex issues, we have complex, and we have more complex. When we think about prevention, universal prevention, that's good for all kids, is relevant in all of these areas, right? But we need to begin to think about some of our more sophisticated prevention efforts that are targeted to kids with more complex needs. These are kids with some family dysfunction. Up here, we need to look at prevention efforts that are even more sophisticated, because our more complex needs are kids who are showing signs of trouble. Those kids who are at the most risk, that highest level of risk, maybe are being constantly removed from the classroom. Some of that 10% you were talking about, right? And sometimes as a community, we get very stuck in this place where we're just going to do a bunch of education and information campaigns and call that prevention. And while that's good with most of the kids that, the 90% of kids who have less things that we can do that's going to benefit all kids. But we have some kids with more complex issues and even more complex issues. So when we begin to understand and map out the strategies and the programs that we're offering to prevent suicidal tendencies among our youth, we can't just think in this space. We have to understand that we have some complexities, and this data allows us to understand that we have multiple opportunities for intervention from a prevention lens, right? Does that make sense? All right, so looking then at, we have the context, all the areas where kids show up and interact in the community. Then we have some categories, right? If you recall when you looked at your data. There are 8 categories that are separated into 2 different places: internal assets and external assets. The external assets are developed through relationships and opportunities to build interpersonal connections with other people in the community. So those are external. The internal assets are the internal strengths that I build inside myself that set me up for self-motivation, self-efficacy, self-regulation, and those sorts of things. Just because it's an internal asset does not mean that kids build it on their own. When we think about prevention, how do we keep kids out of risk behaviors, whether it's drug prevention, teen pregnancy, suicide, academic failure, whatever those risk behaviors are, we have to understand that we have to build relationships to build the external assets, but we have to provide programs and supports that allow young people to build those internal assets. An example that I'll give you, I'm always late. Doesn't matter where I'm going, I'm late. I see the speed limit sign. Speed limit is 55, speed limit is 35, speed limit is 70. I see the sign. I speed anyway, right? Information alone doesn't change behavior. If you want me to change my behavior, you need to help me build internal and external assets. You need to help me do some self-regulation and better planning. You need to teach me how to do some of that so I can get out of the door 10 or 15 minutes earlier and I don't need to speed. You need to create an environment that doesn't accept or allow speeding. You need to monitor. Police officers, that's why they monitor your speed. That's why they give you tickets. The boundaries and expectations. Some of the support, we have to build those external assets. Well, but you can build all those external assets as you want, but if I don't figure out internally that I need to regulate my behavior, if somebody's not helping me do that and build those strengths within myself, I'm gonna keep right on speeding, right? We gotta build in both of those places, and that's the value and the importance of the categories. We need to build assets around support, empowerment, boundaries and expectations, and constructive use of time. We need to build internal assets related to commitment to learning, positive values, social competencies, and positive identity. Thinking about it from a prevention lens is critically important before we get to kids who are diagnosed with depression and anxiety disorders, before we get to a place where kids are actively involved in substance abuse, before we get to a place where kids are being removed from school or failing out of school or choosing to drop out of school. So we need to think of all of this on the prevention end. We have kids with less complex needs. How do we do prevention with them? More complex and more complex, how do we do prevention with them? But we're doing all of this work and building this asset, not so that we can most successfully intervene at the time of crisis or respond after a crisis has happened, but truly to prevent the crisis space. When we look at a little deeper into the categories, here's what we see. These are the categories, here's how it looks. We can see that the highest levels of challenged red and vulnerable orange is constructive use of time, commitment to learning, and positive identity. So where are kids challenged? Constructive use of time, commitment to learning, and positive identity. Let's understand what those are. Constructive use of time, young people need opportunities outside of school to learn and develop new skills and interests with other young people and adults. Commitment to learning, young people need a sense of the lasting importance of learning and a belief in their own abilities. Those words are very important because sometimes when we think about commitment to learning, we want to think about their connection to the school, but this is an internal asset. Do I have sense of future, sense of purpose? Do I understand how what I'm doing today is connected to me achieving that sense of purpose in my life? So that's a very important piece, that commitment to learning. And then we have positive identity. Young people need to believe in their own self-worth and to feel that they have control over the things that happen to them. Any reaction to that? Yes.
I think just, excuse me. I think just looking at it at a glance, the places that, the three things that we just listed, I think all three of them are internal problems that are listed in the thing. So I think, I was just kind of thinking before, I think internal is where we want to start, because I always tell people when they ask me for like relationship advice, for example, I always say that you have to love yourself before you can love others. So I think working from the inside and out might be very beneficial for this group.
Okay. Any other reaction to that or thoughts? Surprised by that? Anybody? You would? Okay. Let's dig just a little bit deeper, one step deeper. When you established your priorities as a group coming out of your data understanding, one of the three priorities that you identified was constructive use of time. Sherry and I spent a great deal of time digging in and understanding this data, and there's something very important about constructive use of time I think that we need to look at. These are the 4 questions that are asked on the Asset Development Survey that assesses whether or not kids have positive opportunity for constructive use of time. The first one, I am involved in a church, synagogue, mosque, or other group. Number 34, I am involved in a sport, club, or other group. Number 40, I am involved in creative things such as music, theater, or art. And number 42, I am spending quality time at home with my parents when we do things together. 90% of the kids that you surveyed, 90% of the kids that you surveyed answered positively I am involved in a sport, club, or other group. 90%. So 9 out of 10 kids are actively involved in a sport, club, or other group. The totality of their responses is why that showed up as a challenge. Because we have far fewer kids who are involved in church, synagogue, mosque, or other religious community. We only have, 31%, 1 out of 3. We have far fewer kids who are involved in creative things such as music, theater, or art, 36%. And we have far fewer kids, well, not far fewer, we have more, but still less kids who are spending quality time at home with my parents doing things. So if we take that only as an orange box that we need to create opportunities for kids to have constructive use of time, we would be busy instead of effective. Because we got to understand the depth of this data. We can't just take it for face value. We can't just go and start creating opportunities for kids to be involved. Because we do have opportunities for kids to be involved. But when we lay this data up against some very important relationship data, and this is where it all ties together, that it's not that kids are not involved in something, as much as when they answer the questions about the adults who work with kids in their space of being involved. Do I feel connected to the adults who work with me? Do I feel connected to my coach? Do I feel connected to my teacher? Do I feel connected to the program provider? Do I feel connected to the drama or theater person who heads up that project? Do I feel connected to the faith leader in my faith community, right? This is where this developmental relationships piece is critically important. And it may not in Geauga County, based on 90% of your kids are involved, it may not be so much that there is a need to provide new opportunities for involvement, as much as helping adults who work with kids understand how to build strong relationships with the kids that they're working with. That's a significant difference. I see some head shaking. What's your reaction or thoughts related to that? Anybody?
I think we'd have done something different if you just didn't show us that breakdown. Because it was activities, club, I think we would have gone a different direction.
Yeah, this data is really very significant. Now your sample size was small, but they mirrored each other in both schools, right? Very similar in both schools. What this data is showing you specifically, we asked kids, how many strong relationships do you have? And the greatest that they could have is 4. You didn't ask about 5, you asked about 4. But this is a standardized chart from search. So 5 is there, disregard that. 11% of kids, 11%, 1 out of 10 kids who took this survey, 1 out of 10, said that I have no strong relationships with adults.
The answers to their questions indicate that.
Yes, yes, yes.
So
The answers to their questions.
Does adults include parents and caregivers?
It includes
Adults-
Or just adults in the community that are not their family?
Parents, friends, teachers, other school staff, and adults who lead activities they participate in outside of school.
So 1 out of 10, I think that's significant. That's a lot of kids, right?
And to your point of the strongest connection is with family.
26% report that I have 1 strong relationship. 1 out of 4 say that I have 1 strong relationship. 20%, 1 out of 5, say that I have 2 strong relationships with adults. 16% say I have 3 strong, and 27% say that I have 4 strong. Now, what I should have done, and I never realized some of these things until I'm up in front of a group talking, so my apologies, but what would have been interesting is to look at the overall asset score of kids who are vulnerable, challenged, thriving, compared to the number of positive relationships, right? Because I think you can begin to see where this data begins to mold together, right? So we've got some categories and context that are red flags, but we've also got some relationship pieces that are critically important. Yes?
I think, and again, like you said, I wish, there's lots of wishes always. I would be very interested to know if they would be able to target who these folks are, because it's my best guess, like with Michelle and Brittany back at Berkshire, there are probably 2 of them, and they're overwhelmed. Or it's the football coach who has 85 kids on a team, and that others he's maybe not be able to give so much attention to. Because I think the folks that some of these kids identify with take up so much of the coach's time, so much of the counselor's time, that it leaves others just hanging out there where, 100 years ago when I was in school, the social emotional scars and needs weren't so deep, and we could all have access to a counselor, all have access to a coach. I think it'd be very interesting to see who they placed that with, or who they were longing to have that with.
Mm-hmm. Right. And if you ask 100 kids, if they all identify the same 2 people, that's what you're saying, right?
2, 3, and because all you have to do is spend one day, take that camera, put it outside the counselor's office.
Right.
They're overwhelmed.
Yes.
Or the folks who come in with our partners.
Yes.
They're overwhelmed the minute they walk in.
And I'm a dork. I love what we're doing here, and I love to see the conversations happen in the community. So what you're saying to me, I literally got cold chills. Because for me, I know I'm a dork. For me, that's the opportunity. How do we help adults who work with kids build strong, positive relationships within the context of what they already do, right? That you don't have to be best friends. I don't have to take you home for dinner as a 17-year-old young man in my class, or as a participant in the Girl Scouts program that I'm running. But there are some key strategies that we can equip adults with to create that positive relationship space so that all adults have an opportunity, because the issues that young people are presenting are so pervasive and in too many cases way too deep, right? That they're all showing up at the counselor's office, feeling isolated, not feeling very efficient as individuals, not feeling connected to their future, all of those sorts of things that we see showing up. There are ways to equip adults with, so that the young people have opportunities to feel connected to those adults before we get to a place that I feel so defeated that I need a counselor, right? That's the opportunity that we're talking about. So these developmental relationships and the data that you have here is really important. And part of the reason that it's so important, lots of words on this slide, and the individual words don't matter as much as the lines. Because what this says is, I don't think you guys have this one in your packet, but we'll send it. What this says is, if I have 0 strong relationships, how likely am I to be motivated academically? Versus if I have 5 strong relationships, how motivated am I to achieve academically? Do I care about learning? If I have 0 strong relationships, how motivated am I to respect other people's feelings and to make and keep good friendships? Versus if I have 5 strong relationships with adults, how motivated am I to make and keep strong, positive relationships with friends and to care about other people's feelings? Some of that violence piece and bullying, right? If I have strong relationships with adults, I'm far more likely. If I have 0 strong relationships versus 5 strong relationships, do I take responsibility for my own actions, and do I do my best on tasks, even tasks I don't like? If I have 0 versus if I have 5. This one is, do I engage in high-risk behaviors such as alcohol use, tobacco use, or violent behaviors? If I have 0 strong relationships, I'm more likely to engage in those negative behaviors versus if I have 5. Does that make sense? So the individual words are not as important as these trend lines. Those are very, very important. If I have positive relationships, my ability to engage in positive behavior goes up. If I have positive relationships, my willingness and desire to engage in negative behavior goes down. based on everything that we just talked about, positive relationships is not the only solution to the challenge that you're having. But based on the data that you collected, it's a significant part. Significant. So what are the components of a positive relationship? Supporting you when you're sad, or when you're anxious, or when you're struggling. But providing that support and that encouragement on what are you trying to achieve? Where are you trying to get? How is this math class connected to your aspirations? I have 3 daughters. They're 13, 14, and 16 years old. And I can't tell you in a week how many conversations we have about math class and it has no relevance to their life, right? So I do address that one as a parent often. But the point being, how is what we are doing here, not just what we're doing here, but connected to where you want to be and where you want to go in your life? Step number 1 in that is understanding the young people that we're working with and interacting with. What do you want? Where do you want to go, right? Do young people who interact with adults feel like that is important to the adult that they're working with? Critical question. And then this 5th one, which is very important, is in relationships between kids and adults, is to expand possibilities. We're going to talk in just a second about your inventory of programs and services that are available in your community. And one of the things that you saw was single interventions. Program here, program here, program here, program here. Not connected to each other. And young people report in their relationships with adults that part of the reason there's not a deepness, a depth, or a richness in those relationships is because I have a relationship with you, which is separate than a relationship with you, which is separate than a relationship with you, which is separate than a relationship from you. Which allows me even to behave differently with you, than with you, and with you, and with you. So how do we begin to build those connections between the parts and the pieces of a young person's life? The example that I give, my oldest daughter danced for 8 hours a week. She was a dancer. Had a back injury. Could no longer dance. One day she was no longer a dancer. Right? So she had to figure out, well, how do I fill my time? And my job as a parent was to help her figure out how to fill her time. So she went off to high school. She got very involved in the drama and the theater productions and those sorts of things. So for 6 weeks, twice a year, she's very busy. But only for 6 weeks, twice a year. And so she now has the rest of those days that used to be filled with dance that are empty, wide open spaces for her. And so I had a conversation with the drama teacher as her parent about how can we connect Chloe to other opportunities that support her desire to be actively engaged in theater. And what we were able to do was begin to build connections for all of the kids involved in drama and theater. So that the drama teacher was now having conversations with kids that are involved in the drama club about what are you interested in? Why are you in theater? What do you want to get out of this? How is this important? Well, I don't know, I like to sing. Or one day I want to be up on stage. I'm too afraid now, but I'd like to be up on stage. And these are the kind of conversations the drama teacher is now having with the young people in an effort to expand their possibilities and their opportunities. Connecting kids who are already on stage to opportunities in community. Supporting them in understanding theater opportunities in college when they leave high school. So it's beginning to connect the parts and the pieces of their lives and not leaving these wide open gaps in an effort to expand their possibilities. Any reaction to that? These are the elements of a strong developmental relationship. Tell me what that means to you and why that's important. Why is it important to this group?
Well, if you don't build rapport with kids, they're not going to come to you with anything that they might be faced with, dealing with. I have lots of thoughts about everything you've been talking about. I have lots of thoughts. Going back a couple slides about how you were saying that, it's a big disproportion between like the 90% of kids that are involved in groups and then, I find that in this day and age, so I was sitting here trying to answer it from my own 14-year-old's perspective, and I'm pretty sure he would feel pretty good about all of those because I make a very strong effort not just to be focused on like the clubs and the sports, but in this day and age, if a kid is a basketball player, they're playing basketball year-round. They're told you can't really play any other sport. You don't have time. On Sunday mornings, we might have games, so you can't go to church. So I think for families, they're pulled in 1,000 directions because their kids might have this passion, and that's the way our society is going now, where it's all or nothing. So I think that is going to have to be a lot of family education on that end of it, to tell parents, it's okay, they're not probably going to be the next LeBron. You can let them go to church on Sunday and play a board game on Saturday night. Anyway, that was that piece of it. But I don't know. I tell teachers all the time at my school, like, if you want a kid to do well in your class, talk to them, build a relationship with them. And I think our teachers are so stressed because they have so much hanging over their heads about test scores and making sure the kids perform the way they need to, where they don't feel like they have the time to do all those things that you had up on the other side. Like on a one-to-one basis in a middle school or high school, when you have over 100 students, how are you connecting to all of them on all those levels? So just some challenges, I think, that a lot of families and teachers and school people face. And you're so right with the counselors. Like, there's so many kids. There's probably, I can count on two hands the kids that take up the majority of my time. And then there's the ones that are trying to send me emails, hey, can I come talk about my schedule? Like, when are you free? And I'm like, well, next Wednesday. I don't know. But I think that's hard too, because we see those 10 kids as the highest risk kids, that if we don't touch base with them one day, who knows what they might go and do. But then a lot of these times, the kids we don't reach out to are the ones that do stuff that, like the suicide stuff.
The funny thing is, like, if you were able to establish relationships, test scores would go up. The funny thing is, test scores would go up.
Right.
We're putting our energy in the wrong place. The other thing is, when we were listing these, I was thinking about, and as an administrator, you always know who these people are in your building. Not the counselor, the counselors, that's who the kids go to, but there are those people in your building that every kid gravitates to, and that's because of this. Like,
Right.
Berkshire, like, I'm thinking of when our teacher, Carol Nicola, every kid in the whole world, like Ledgemar, would be in her classroom. You know what I mean? Like, if there was a problem, they head down to, if I ever needed to find a problem kid, I would head down there, because I knew that's where they were. You know what I mean? Because she did all of these things. There are certain individuals that just embody that, and the kids just gravitate to them.
Right.
And I also think teachers are afraid to talk to kids because there is so much mental health.
Yeah.
And I just had a teacher last week who a student reached out to her talking about self-harm, and she came to me, what do I do? And I gave her a crash course real quick, and she did it, and she talked to the student. But, and that was very helpful because we rely on our teachers too to build that rapport with students. But they're often afraid. They don't know how to approach kids. They don't know how to deal with, the issues that they're facing.
The other part of that is, some of that is just personality.
Yeah.
Donna's not a very warm and fuzzy person, and I give her a training on how to make relationships. That's not going to make the kids relate to her anymore.
Right.
The kids relate to who they identify with.
That's true.
And, so that's a challenge too, because there are some adults who just don't have that. No matter what they do or how hard they try real hard to establish a relationship. They don't have whatever that is that connects them. The kids connect with them. And other adults, like you say, kids flock to them. I don't think it's anything that's been taught. It's just their character.
Their make.
Yeah, right.
And there's nothing wrong with that necessarily.
No, nothing wrong with it.
But at
it's
the
just,
same time, we need to equip the others who do want to help and, just don't know really how.
And sometimes maybe it's just an awareness thing.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? It's just an awareness.
These pieces of information, right? Sometimes just helping adults who work with kids understand how impactful their relationship could potentially be. And in many cases, not all, but in many cases, when we put some data behind that, that's a little bit more of a motivator to, okay, let me really try this on for size. But there are some strategies that every adult can be offered to build that skill set. And again, they may never be the one in the building that everybody gravitates to, but they're part of a network of adults who support young people. It changes the environment and the culture and the sense of ownership and belonging for the young people in that space. Now, the other question that I want to ask you, particularly, well, I don't know who in your building would answer this, but how many outside providers do you have come in and work in your school?
A lot.
Right, because,
One of the things I think we learned in this exercise of doing this was just how many there are and when they're there and who they are, and sometimes we don't even know. And I say that as the principal of the building, I don't always know who all the people in my building are, and I really should, but there's so many that come in for different things, I don't always know who they are,
right, right.
or what they're doing.
Exactly. And there's an opportunity to create an expectation, right? That components be built into all programs and services that come into your building that strengthen the relationship between that program provider and the youth. I was a program provider. I don't know how many of you around the table were program providers. And my job was to go into the building, provide a program, and report it to my funder. Right? Right? We're doing a program to kids. We're seeing children and young people only as targets of change, when in reality they are the agents of change, right? They become the change makers when we support them in the way that they deserve to be supported. So how do we build relationships, not just from our faculty and staff who are trying so desperately to educate our children, but we utilize those resources that are coming into our buildings in new and innovative ways, and make the request that you, as a provider, equip your staff to build relationships and to share information with the school. But most importantly, across providers. Because that's the other thing that happens. You come in and do programs and report to your funder, and you come in and do programs, and you, and you, and you, and you, and you. And there's no connection between those programs and services. And we have the right and the responsibility on behalf of our young people to demand that there's some connection between those programs and services. There's communication. And working with communities where it's either the administrator, it's the county level funder, or some other entity who says, everybody who touches 7th graders has to meet in July or August to figure out who's touching them and when and how. And I'm doing some work with violence prevention, and I'm trying to remember that we don't say who's touching kids, right? It's a language issue that I'm trying to work on. I'm presenting at a state conference this summer, and I'm trying to work on the language, and I just realized I did it again. Who's working with kids in this building? And y'all need to get together and get some flip chart paper on the wall and map out the programs and strategies that you're offering. Because when we do this, we sometimes have a similar experience to what you have when you looked at, when you kind of did that preliminary inventory of what are we offering for 7th graders. We learned a couple of things. We have many, many, many one-time programs. People who come in one time and do something, and then they go away. The research shows us over and over and over, there is a minimal of value to that, right? If it's just an intervention one day and you go away, 1 hour and you go away, and not connected to a broader set of strategies and supports. The other thing that we see in communities is that oftentimes, most oftentimes, those are education strategies. I'm going to come in, and as the target of change, as the participant in my program, and that's the only way that I see you, I'm going to give you information. I'm going to give you a pre and post test. I'm going to measure whether you know something different in an hour than you did an hour before. And that's what I'm going to report to my funder. And over and over and over and over, these are information strategies. We're just throwing information at young people. Instead of building a supportive environment of programs and services that not only increases their knowledge, but gives them a chance to build some of those internal assets and those external assets and those relationships with adults that are so critically important. The other thing that we see when we do many inventories of programs and services in the schools is that we have 14 providers who provide 14 programs or services. 13 of those 14 are education strategies. First of all, we're just trying to teach kids lots of things beyond what they're trying to learn in math class. We're just throwing information. But that 10 of those 14 all come in September, right? when we begin to understand it and map it out, instead of understanding what's the totality of the programs and supports that are available to the kids. And then the second thing is, everybody's just doing it for their own outcomes that they might have made up at their own computer when they were writing a grant application. Instead of strategically aligning those programs and supports to a shared outcome. If our expectation is that we decrease the level of anxiety that young people in our community are experiencing, there is no one program and no one person that is going to achieve that. It takes us working together, collecting some common data, so that we all know we're all accountable for decreasing anxiety. It's not just agency B or school C or parent F. We all are working towards decreasing anxiety in kids. So when I work with communities in this space, and a lot of times we want to jump in and say, what are we going to do about it? We got our data, now what are we going to do about it? Well, there's a middle space. There's some work that needs to be done to really understand what are the resources that are available to us. Many communities are resource rich and innovation poor, right? We just keep doing the same thing over and over and over, year after year after year, and hoping something works. Instead of being innovative about our understanding of what are the resources we have available and how do we use them strategically to achieve the outcomes that we seek to achieve. So, after all of this data and all of this understanding and the many months of work that this group has done, you identified 3 primary goals. 3 very good goals, 3 very relevant goals to young people today. The first one is improved mental health. What do we mean by that? Wellness, social emotional development, decreased anxiety, decreased depression, decreased suicidal ideation. So we want to achieve improved mental health as a collective. Is that still a priority? Good. The second one is we got to do something about social media. I'm begging, as a parent of a 13, 14, and 16-year-old, I hope we can figure this out. Social media, the impact on mental health and wellness, concern about electronic relationships, and limited interpersonal skills and health concerns. We just talked about those self-efficacy, the category of personal assets, the category of social assets, and building relationships between people, particularly their peers, and how critical that is if kids are going to thrive. And we have this whole new monster, this elephant in the room, called social media, that I don't feel like as communities we're responding as quickly and as innovatively as we need to be. And the impact on our young people is profound. And we're seeing data that supports that. Where even the number of likes is releasing dopamine in the brain, very similar to addiction, right? Having 3 tween daughters, anybody who parents in this space, aunt, uncle, grandparent, y'all get it. It's a serious issue. So do we agree that the second priority is still social media? Good. The third is the transition between grades. We know that the time of increased risk, from drug use to academic dropout, all of those risk behaviors, violent relationships, teen pregnancy, not taking care of your health and your body, all of those things, those risk behaviors increase during times of transition. And oftentimes occurs more often at a building transition, right? When we transition from 8th grade to 9th grade, if that's a building transition, or from 6th grade to 7th grade, if that's a building transition. There are significant transitional spaces for our young people. I would challenge communities too, particularly in the complex and the more complex space, if we're truly going to get to the root of the mental health and social health and physical health and emotional health of our young people, we have to understand the complexities. We have some general times of high risk, those transition between buildings. But there are other transitions that put kids at even more elevated risk. I have a parent that went off to be incarcerated. I've been removed from my home. Some of those critical, high-risk transition times as families fall apart in the opiate epidemic. And I'm being removed and now raised by a grandparent. There are some of those significant, we talk about the weight on counselors. Some of that is our responsibility in the prevention realm to figure out how do we create a series of prevention supports? How do we understand who these kids are who are at the most risk and connect them to prevention programs and services so they can successfully transcend the transition? Instead of ending up in a place where I feel depleted, I feel defeated, I feel insufficient, and I don't know how to have control of my own environment. How can we prevent that from happening? Because those are the kids who are going to show up in the vulnerable category. Those are the kids who are going to show up who are reporting suicidal ideation. Those are the kids, along with others, but we can't just stay in this space where we see all kids as one. There are varying levels of risk, and those risks need to be addressed from the preventative space. Because the third grader who's been removed from the home because they have an actively addicted parent who is now incarcerated is not usually engaged in risk behaviors. But boy, are they at risk for getting there by 5th grade, 8th grade, 12th grade, right? So we're still talking about prevention, but some of that targeted prevention versus the universal. If we're going to be successful, we got to speak and intervene in both of those levels. So that allows us to draw a picture for your community. We have the data. You've identified your priorities. How do we use the data to create a roadmap for where we're going? How are we going to measure it and know where we're getting to? So before we turn to that page, I'm going to give you all a break because it's time. I can see that your eyes and your butts are tired. You need a drink and all of those sorts of things. So let's take a break and we build a comprehensive response. We can, in fact, in a very short period of time, begin to make significant strides in changing what is the current challenge. So I'm a firm believer in that, but to get there, to do that, we gotta get and understand the picture. Now, this is called a logic model. I hate to use that word, but logic models are like lima beans. They're good for you even though you hate them. Right?
I've never heard you say that.
They are. When I was president of the Coalition for a Drug-Free Greater Cincinnati, then Congressman Portman and I would have board meetings at 8 a.m. on Monday mornings. In preparations for those meetings, he would inevitably call me at home at about 7:30, 8 o'clock at night and say, let's get ready for our meeting in 12 hours. And I would say, absolutely, let's do that. So he called me one night and he said, Rhonda, lots of people are talking about this same logic model thing. Can you build one for our coalition for the board meeting in the morning? Has anybody built a logic model ever? I did not sleep that night because this is a tremendous amount of work to build a logic model. And then I put it up and it was so bad and so complicated, he leaned over and he's like, turn it off because it was so bad and complicated. So I have perfected the art of building logic models and building them in a way that are simple. That's good for you. Because what my job is, part of my job coming in here, is to take all of the work that you've done, all of the conversations that you've had, all of the data that you've considered, and do some interpretation. So you all don't have to stay up all night long trying to figure out how to organize it. So here's what I propose to you in terms of a roadmap for moving forward. It is a draft based on the work that you've done. So what we have is, in the pink box on the far left-hand side, what we say is that we want to achieve youth well-being. That's our ultimate goal. And we're going to measure that with the overall asset score. We want to, at a minimum, maintain 60% of kids who are thriving or adequate. That's a minimum. Ideally, we would see an increase of the number of kids who are thriving or adequate. Yes.
But what's that normal number? I mean, I know there's no such thing as a normal number, you want 100% and all that good stuff, but what would be a good target goal for well-being, other than 60%?
And that's, you can define that as a community. I don't know that it's fair to compare between communities, right?
They don't put it out there for that reason.
Yeah.
The Search Institute doesn't create it.
My recommendation would be that in the first 24 months, your first 2 years, when you're going to go back in 2 years and collect this data, your first 24 months after interventions is that you would maintain that 60%, right? you can't predict the increase because you don't have historical data. So you don't know if you've seen 5% a year decrease or 0.5% a year decrease, or 5% an increase or 0.5% increase. So you can't really predict. So your expectation is that you would maintain that 60% of the kids in Geauga County report assets at the thriving or adequate level.
Would we all agree? I mean, this is, anecdotally, there's been a decrease. Am I off base in saying that? I mean, if you go back 10 years, it's just, maybe it's because my position has changed, but my perception has changed.
I would say that too, for the work I've done with kids, absolutely.
Say what? I missed the first part.
That we've had a decrease over the last 5, 10 years. We don't know what the numbers are, but anecdotally, we can say there has been. So if we maintain, that would be a victory of sorts.
A victory.
I would agree.
Yes.
Most communities.
I think that you could also, wait, hold on, let me. Are we able to answer if it's a low C or a high C?
It's, no.
We can't answer that.
I mean, with some work, we probably could, but today we can't.
Today we can't. Okay. But
We have
that's
to
a
put a
good,
lot of things together and then merge them and average them and do both schools and all that. So, no.
If this committee is interested in you guys continuing to do that for an additional contract, is that all right?
yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Because I think it's a really good question, and I think it speaks to some of what you're speaking to, right? We can maintain that 60%, but we can aim to increase from a low C to a high C, right?
Because that might be a lot of movement without seeing it if you just look at
Right,
it.
Yes.
without seeing the color
Yeah.
change on the graph.
And then another question is, well, when you said 24 months, that's a pretty big time, especially when this data is 7th graders. That's a huge developmental span between a
Yes.
7th grader and a 9th grader. How much is that going to be by development only? Well, you know, other risk, you know, there's a lot of things that happen between 7th and 9th grade that, how do we know whether it's having to do with programming or whether it's having to do with just
Right.
development, positive or negative?
Yes, any predictable increase, right?
Mhm.
Or decrease
Either
based on
way, yeah.
development. And I'm sure that research is out there, and I don't know that, but I asked Sherry to write that down because that's another question that we could potentially answer for you that will help you know what's the percent increase or decrease that we want to project,
All
right? All right. So the other measurements that can be used in this space for youth well-being is engagement in risk behaviors or engagement in health enhancing behaviors. So we can gather data and know, are kids using alcohol, tobacco, and other drugs? Are kids engaged in early sexual behavior? Are kids staying in violent, intimate relationships? Are kids achieving academically? Are kids making healthy lifestyle choices? Are some of those risk and health enhancing behaviors? We can measure them as well. But because the data that we've looked at thus far is specifically the asset survey, what we've recommended is let's just stay with the overall asset score, right? There are other ways to measure it, but why get complicated? Now, let me move on to blue boxes. So our theory of change says, if we want youth well-being, we have to achieve some intermediate successes. We can't just go do programs and think that we're going to get youth well-being. We got to aim a little bit based on our understanding. So based on the priorities that you set, basically what you're saying is if we want youth well-being, we have to first achieve youth mental health, we have to achieve youth who successfully navigate social media, and we have to achieve youth who are supported during times of transition. We cannot have youth well-being if we don't achieve those things. Agreed? Then we have to break it down even a step further. Because youth mental health is big and huge and broad, is it not? There's lots of parts and pieces to it. And again, we can't just start throwing programs at youth mental health. We got to break it down a little bit further. So what this says in the green box, if we want to improve youth mental health, we have to have youth who have a positive sense of self-efficacy, and a sense of purpose. And we have to have parents and adults who work with youth who are equipped to assist youth in times of crisis. There are many facets of youth mental health that we can address. But we have to start with some small pieces. And what this says is, if we have youth who have a positive sense of self, And if we have parents and adults who are equipped to help youth at a time of crisis, then we will, in fact, in 12 to 24 months, begin to see improvements in youth mental health. Is that fair? Is that a viable statement? There's lots of parts of youth mental health that we can work on, but these are the ones we want to start with. Going to the next box, youth successfully navigate social media. If we want youth to be able to successfully navigate social media, we have to have youth who have knowledge and skills to avoid toxic comparisons on social media. I don't know how versed we are all in social media, but that impact of following people and feeling like my life is less than, or I am less than because my site is not as exciting as your site, or I only got 36 likes and you got 99.
That's because I'm cool.
Because you're and I'm less than, right? So some of the skills, again, if we go back to some of our early prevention efforts in other areas, teen pregnancy prevention, academic achievement, drug prevention, we did a lot of media literacy, a lot of teaching about, it looks like if you drink alcohol, you're going to have the pretty girlfriend and the fancy boat. But let's talk about what really happens, right? So doing some of that skill building and understanding and how to navigate, how do I regulate as a teenager, as a young teenager, hell, at this point, 8-year-old, right? It's getting younger and younger and younger. How do I navigate that? Not only do I need to know it, but I need some skills and some coping tools on how to navigate it. When I wake up at 6:30 in the morning to get ready for school, and it starts as soon as before my feet hit the floor in too many cases, right? So, skills and knowledge to avoid toxic comparisons. Parents actively monitor their child's use of social media. I'm a parent of 3 tweens, as I've said multiple times, and I struggle with how to actively monitor social media. Because every time I pick up their phone, there's a new app, and I have no idea how to navigate it, right? So, I'm not connected, neither are their friends' parents or other people who keep an eye out for me on behalf of a parent. So, parents actively monitor their social media. How, as a parent, do I build a network of other adults who are paying attention to what my child is doing on social media? So there are some skills that can be built in that space. Parents and adults understand the impact of social media on mental health. Youth have skills to self-regulate screen time. And that really important one, that parents and other adults model responsible screen time for youth. So, if we want youth to successfully navigate social media, we're saying these are our targets in the beginning. These are the things that we want to address with our programs and services. Does that make sense? Yes, no, maybe? Okay. Youth are supported during times of transition. If we want to decrease the risk during those times of transition, what do we need to address? We need youth who have access to opportunities that match their interest, particularly during those transition times. We need programs and services that are targeted during those times of transition. So it's not hit or miss, that we understand kids are at risk, what are the programs and services we need. And we need adults who connect youth to other people and places. What's not showing there is in the community. Adults who connect youth to other people and places in the community. So it's that creating connection, adults who help kids create those connections between the parts of their lives. So, if we want youth to be supported during times of transition, these are the things that we want kids to have. If they have these, they'll be supported. If they have these, they will be better off. That's the picture. That's the theory of change based on our review of the data, your priorities, discussion, and research. So, somebody point out to me a part of this that you feel like speaks to your work. This is right on target.
All the social media stuff.
Who said all the social media stuff? All right, good.
Yeah, I wonder how much the social media part plays into the problems of the first part. And so, if we really want to address mental health, I'm not sure you can separate social media at this point from that.
I think we keep saying social media, but maybe as a secondary, just media in general.
Yeah.
You know,
yeah.
I think those of us who are older than some others, you know, I was the remote control in my house. And after a certain time, the Native American head came on the TV, and that was the end of TV for the day. So there was an off. So it wasn't, okay, Lifestyles of the Rich and Famous showed you that you should have this, and then at a certain time, there was no media. There's media anytime they want, 24/7. They can listen to a radio, they can see it on TV that this is the best new car and you should be doing this, and watching this Republican beat this Democrat and this Democrat beat this Republican. It's not just social media, it's you are supposed to be here and you're supposed to be mean, you're supposed to be rich, you're supposed to be number one, and if you're not, you stink. So social media is the number one because it's how they hit each other, but I think the media
As a whole.
is still part
The
of it.
redefinition of the impact on culture.
They can't
right?
walk away from it.
Oh, right.
It's the social media addiction, it's their smartphone addiction, as I have mine welded in my hand.
Any other relevance, or does this resonate? Does it make sense the way that the information is organized? Because here's the challenge. Programs and strategies, the purple box. Notice that those boxes are blank. What are we going to do to achieve what we want to achieve? Those boxes are blank on purpose. There's this yellow box called Conditions for Success. Any programs and strategies that we create need to be filtered through the conditions for success. So let me talk about those, and it's the framework for your collective work. The first one is there are agreed upon practices across providers and systems. Sometimes we don't need a new program as much as we need a new practice. So I gave the example earlier. Any programs that are offered in the 7th grade, those providers need to be convened, though there needs to be some connections between programs. We need to inventory who's doing education, who's doing skill building. How can we create opportunities to build relationships between youth and adults in all of the programs? How do we ensure that all of the programs offered to 7th and 8th graders are trauma informed? How do we equip 8th grade service providers, any service providers in the school, with some help in successfully navigating the transition to high school? There are even some more basic and simple things. We require that every program that is offered in the school ask a series of 4 questions at the beginning. What do you aspire to be? What's your favorite subject in school? How many brothers and sisters do you have? I can't think of the 4th one right off the top of my head. But every program service provider who comes into the school asks those 4 questions. So that those program service providers are not just here pushing information into the brains of these kids to report to their funder. There's actually some relationship building. We're going beyond just education to do a little more important work based on what we're trying to achieve. Those are shared practice changes versus program changes. Yes?
The one thing I was gonna say, like with that too, when you look at your green column, there's like 10 of them, 4 of them include parents.
Mm-hmm.
And so, like really having the buy-in of the parents, and I know, like even just our group here, like we have the students, which is great, and everyone else then is professionals, but maybe you really do think, like, should we open it to parents? And I don't know which parents you open it to, but again, like in each okay, well maybe not in the supported during transition, but in all the other ones, there's a parent component to it, but we don't have like a parent representative like on the committee. And so if you're really going to have it be successful and have that buy-in and figure out how to make it work, like do we need to include them? Because again, almost half of them have that on there.
I think one of the other things that's really important is that, yes, who are those key influencer parents? I call them intermediaries. We wanted parents to participate in a survey in one of the communities I was working in. And instead of the coalition or this collective group saying, parent, will you fill out the survey? Oh, by the way, we're the drug people. No, they're not answering the survey. They're not sending it back. But we went through the athletic boosters. And the athletic boosters sent the email link to all parents saying, you need to do this survey because we need information about whatever. A county level parent network that meets the needs of all of those providers, or at least individual parent networks. And that's not the responsibility of the school necessarily, as much as it is an agreement among those providers that we're not all gonna try to talk to parents, we're gonna collectively try to talk to and work with parents, right? A little bit of a difference. Yes?
This group also suggested that they have teacher intermediaries as well at one point in time, if you guys remember that, because you can't give every teacher everything. And a lot of times teachers are, I'm too busy, so you pick those key teachers that you can train, pass information back and forth
Yes.
as well, so.
Absolutely.
It's the same.
Yes. All right, so the first one is the agreed upon practices across providers and services. The second is the continuous communication. I can't spell, so I'm not gonna predict how many typos are here. But continuous communication to assure strategically aligned resources and services. That is very connected to number 3, scaled or innovative strategies to fill the service gaps. We have to do an inventory of what are the support services and supports that are out there. And we have to ask a couple of key questions. Who is working towards improved youth mental health in our community? Who? And we need to list them and we need to inventory them. And you guys have some programs or some strategies coming up, your silos of excellence. You have some things set up to do that. The second one is, what outcome are those programs, supports, and services aimed at achieving? Because I guarantee that you'll begin to see some overlap in those outcomes. And we can begin to say, okay, well, we have 6 providers who are working towards improving self-efficacy and sense of purpose in young people's lives. We have 6 providers who want to come in and do crisis response support for our students. We have 6 providers who want to provide therapy and counseling. You see what I'm saying? Inventory those service providers, bring them together and understand what are the goals that they're trying to achieve. The power of this kind of collective group is to build some shared accountability and some ahas across those providers so that it's not just me in competition with you, in competition with you. But we can begin to understand that we're all working with the same population of kids and we got to figure out how to do that a little bit better. And instead of, I go out and get a grant to do some program, and now I'm going to come at the school and say, I want to do this program in your school, there's a middle step. There's a connection across providers to say, here's this new funding opportunity that we got as an agency to do this program to achieve this goal. How does that fit into our big picture? If we're going to achieve the lofty goals that we need to achieve for the benefit of our kids, that's the work we need to be doing. That's very different than designing and implementing a new program. Vastly different. If we have local funders, county boards, somebody who has influence or credibility over those who provide programs and services, they can serve as the convener. But a lot of times when we look at youth well-being, youth mental health, youth in social media, youth during times of transition, immediately our brain goes to, we gotta do programs for kids. And that's not necessarily the work that needs to be done in this kind of space, as much as let's just kind of slow down to speed up. Let's do an inventory. Who's out there? Who's doing what? What are they trying to achieve? Where's the overlap? Where's the alignment? And very importantly, where are the gaps? Right? And how do we fill those? So this yellow box says that we cannot do programs and strategies until we have filtered it through the yellow box. The yellow box is critical. We have to have coordinated professional development across systems and agencies. This is one that I find interesting. The school district will bring in somebody to do professional development. 2 weeks later, the nonprofit agencies in town will bring in somebody to do professional development. And then 3 weeks later, I don't know, the hospital brings in something to do professional development. Let's use social media as an opportunity. School district brings somebody in to educate their staff, faculty and staff, about the impact of social media. That person comes in, charges a lot of money, goes away. 2 weeks later, the county council, city council, whoever it is, this is the community that I live in, and I'm giving you this example. County council says we're gonna bring in somebody to educate parents about social media, we're gonna hold a town hall meeting, community discussion. They pay lots of money, bring somebody in, they go away. About a month later, the local coalition in town says we're gonna bring somebody in to work with parents about social media. So they bring somebody in, the person does their thing, and they go away. We've now had 3 different experts in our community who are training professionals and parents around the same topic in 3 very different ways. And that's a disservice. Now we've got confusing messages across the community, but we've also wasted a ton of resources. Because had we pooled our resources, we would have only had to pay to bring that person in one time over the course of 3 days. Even if we don't want to all be trained and worked with at the same time. So looking at and how do we coordinate some of those professional development opportunities, both for cost efficiency, but for efficiencies between systems. The power of this kind of collective gives you an opportunity even across school districts in the county. What are our shared priority issues? How do we access resources and bring them to this community? And how do we share the cost associated with that? That's a big deal and an enormous opportunity. So number 6 is shared data and accountability for common outcomes. So often we see the problem and we understand the problem we're trying to adjust only from our individual data set, only from our individual lens, only from our daily experience. What's critically important is we pool those data sets to build a rich data picture across systems. So if we're trying to understand youth mental health, let me ask you, how do we measure youth mental health? How do you currently measure youth mental health in Geauga County? If it's a problem and you've identified it as one of your priority goals, what data do you have that defines youth mental health? How did you establish that as a priority? What data did you use?
Observational. That's observational. That's really what we're seeing. I mean, and we used to, I'm gonna show my age right here, but we used to actually have all kinds of data. Like we used to have a survey called Community That Cares, and we did it every 2 years, and we were able to actually track kids starting in this, fourth grade actually, all the way through every 2 years, and we did it religiously for 3 cycles. And then one year, all hell broke loose. One community's parents went after the school board and said, you can't ask my kids these questions, and then it kind of trickled out through the yes. Yes, the answer is yes. The answer is yes from over there. But anyways. But, so we were able to track, and I will tell you, the mental health agencies, the schools, we use that data. I can show you, we have discs, and I can show you, and we were able to track, kids starting in 4th grade, how they reported, 2 years later, the 6th grades, and we could have tracked how kids were reporting. And then it all stopped. Serious, I mean, like no one would touch it. We can't even add to, school people are really concerned about doing surveys at school now because, if I ask you if you've ever felt suicidal, for God's sakes, you might, it became a very political stance in this community. And that's going to be, when I said earlier, once we get to this level, that will be a challenge. It will be a challenge. That will be a big challenge.
And I think since then we've done, we have mostly observational. I mean, the youth leadership kids do informal surveys in schools. We have a little bit of that. TVP did some survey where you might be able to gauge a little bit. We did an asset checklist a few years ago in one of the schools, but it's all little pieces, parts. But mostly, oh my gosh, guidance counselors experience, I think we went on a lot. There's a bigger line.
Even student input, yes, the students were feeling.
There are just more issues.
This data that this report, just as an aside, I don't remember the good old days, but it was right around the time when that campaign, we saw, we're talking decades ago, there was a high incidence of underage drinking And so we could actually see the campaign, Parents Who Host Lose the Most, once that actually hit, and, we've seen that it actually had an impact in our community. That we saw that drinking incidents went down. We also saw that marijuana use went up.
Right?
You know what I mean? As we can.
Something to replace.
Well, what I'm just saying, but the takeaway was we were so focused on underage drinking that, you know what I mean? Like you said, if it doesn't complete the circle, if you're only working on one thing, and the thing we were working on, we impacted. But there was so much, you know what I mean? And so it was great data, but we can't, that anymore. But it was for 8 years. Like
I think it was not, I think we went 3 or 4 cycles, it was
Yeah.
9 years.
It was,
9 years
it
of
was,
data.
it was amazing.
Was somebody else gonna say something? Or somebody? Okay. So, a couple of things I want to respond to there. One is, you said observational data with a little bit of a chuckle, right? Observational data is incredibly valid data. It just has to be documented. So if we can say that quarterly, or twice a year, or annually, we are checking in with all of the school counselors, and they are providing us with either an observational or a non-identified number of, or we're not identifying clients, we're just reporting an aggregate number of kids who are presenting with anxiety issues. That is incredibly valid data. We just have to document it and create a process for collecting it, right? So many communities struggle with data collection because of whatever reason, they can't do a survey. There are ways to get the data, we just have to document it and create the process. The other thing communities do is that they rely on a single survey to give them the total definition. When there are multiple data sources that we can use to gather the information that we need. So we have school counselors who can give us information about the prevalence or the frequency that kids are showing up with issues related to mental health. You probably can gather that information from a hospital or an emergency room, getting zip code data for your county if you don't have a hospital in your county. How many kids are showing up in the emergency room who are presenting with mental health issues? You can even get that information from places like Job and Family Services, of the families that you're working with. How many of the kids are presenting with mental health issues? What are those mental health issues? So there are ways to collect that data and to measure youth mental health. But what's critically important is to move from busy to effective, you have to establish the measurement. So if it is the observational data from counselors that you are going to use, then create the questionnaire and the process that the counselors are going to feed information to you and start the process before you start your interventions, right? There's a lot of work to do before we get to programs and strategies. We have to create some benchmarks. 60% of the kids who are showing up for our school counselors based on counselor observation are presenting with anxiety and depression or suicidal ideology. That's good data. And in next year when we come back in May, they can say, well, still seeing about 60% based on my experience, or we're up about 80%, or we've decreased. But we want to set up some of those benchmarks before you start with your strategies and programs. Yes?
I was just sharing with Karen, David, I'm not sure if you're using it. Do you use the Google form, Mr.
Yes.
Callan? Yeah. We created something in West Geauga where it's a Google form. Every time we see a student or talk to a parent, it's our way of logging our notes. But in order to collect some data too, one of the things we check is what was the reason for seeing. And anxiety, depression is, I just printed it out actually the other day to take a look at it, and that's my biggest. So if we wanted to use something like that in all those goals, or I don't want to make any more work for anybody, but if somebody even wants to just, they don't have to do their notes that way, but if they even wanted to just log what the reason behind it was, I can share that, so just looking at it.
So I'm wondering, so I'm listening, and So that's for the guidance counselors. But then say next year your school employed a social worker, and now that social worker's seeing all those kids and not you. It's still prevalent, it might even have gone up, you know what I mean? But if you're not, that's just one measure. Because, I was thinking, all the places that we collect data, social workers, I'm in charge of the county social workers, and they, they're what they build in Medicaid, their codes, it's easy pull. Early child intervention, how many kids are coming, we track when people come into early childhood intervention, there's why are they receiving early intervention? You know what I mean, like, so there's data there. I mean, there's across the data, but if you're not checking the same thing all the time, you're gonna.
But the beauty of creating this infrastructure is if that change happens and the social worker goes into that school, that communication is taking place because you're closing the loop. There was a change. Now we got how are we gonna address it? Okay, when we look at what the counselors are seeing in this school, we gotta include this number. So you stay relevant.
Well, that's why I guess that's the awareness that everyone just has to remain, communicative.
Right.
Because just because we see a decrease doesn't mean there was a decrease. It means someone else picked up the slack.
Absolutely.
But that's to stay true to the process is what you're saying. If you stay true to the process, then that should be covered.
Exactly. And the process is the communication and the dynamic interaction, not the always creation of the programs and stuff.
Correct. It's the dynamics of what happens around this table and that feedback loop that I drew at the very beginning. We know something, kids are suffering from depression. Let's try something, and we try out those strategies. Then we have to come back and say, are they still suffering from depression at greater or less frequency, right? You gotta do that. So tell me then, based on what you just shared with the table, what's the work that has to happen to move to what we need? I know, lack of a better word, what's our to-do list? Yes.
I think looking at these short-term goals, and I think that we have a huge gap here. I think that they're great, but we're saying youth successfully navigate social media, but we're teaching the parents the impact of it. Why are we teaching the parents the impact when the kids don't know the impact? You know what we're kids, we know everything, right? Like, if I see my friends posting stuff on social media, we follow. Like, my mom might say, don't post that, but my friends are saying, post that, and it's just what we do together. You know what I mean? Like, I think that we're missing that youth piece. And I think the parent piece is so important, but
youth education.
Like, we're getting how our parents are helping us, but how are we helping each other?
I think I think you're onto something really, really important.
Kind of like going along with what Kaylee was saying, I was just like brainstorming ideas because what I've kind of noticed in these leadership groups that are implemented into schools and just things that we can apply for, like like Buckeye Girl State, things like those programs. A lot of those programs don't have a combination of the students, not a diversity of the less complex, the complex, and then the more complex. And I think that discourages those students. And honestly, I've heard the other students, maybe the more complex students, complain or say that it basically make fun of people like me or Kaylee in those leadership groups, and they don't think it's beneficial. But there's awesome things that are in those leadership groups, and I think there needs to be more diverse groups allowing them so they feel accepted. And then with that, in those leadership groups, you can start to build those connections with your advisors and those people that you meet within those groups.
Exactly. And one of the things, all the way down at the bottom, adults connect youth to people and places, other opportunities, is if they're showing up in one space, because we can't just do a flyer and say, everybody come to this leadership opportunity, because we're gonna have kids from the universal place who are gonna come, right? For lots of reasons they're gonna come. But as we move up the tier of complexity, if I've just been removed from my home because my mom's an opiate addict and my dad's in jail and now I'm living at my grandparents' house, I'm probably not coming to your leadership group. As much as I want to and as much as I need to, I'm not coming. And so that connection between, if I know I'm working with a young person who is struggling and has some of those complex issues, and I want to keep them out of the space of risk behavior, then I can say to them, you know what, this flyer came across my desk, and I think I see incredible leadership potential. How about if I go with you to the first meeting, or let me connect you to Kaylee, who will take you to the first meeting, or if you're making fun of Kaylee, which I totally can respect, then let me walk you there, or whatever it is, because I'm not going. You're absolutely right. So how do we, through the building of adult youth relationships and the connecting kids to other opportunities, sometimes we stay in the clinical space for the more complex kids, right? We just want to provide them with treatments and supports, when we have to go a step further and connect them to the prevention opportunities. Is that what you're speaking to?
Yeah, like I think all those students, the more complex and the less complex, I think all of them have leadership abilities, and everyone has it inside them. They just truly need that like external people really pushing that internal self to like for it to come out. And I think creating more diverse leadership groups will help that. And I think I mean, it might be hard to get them motivated in the beginning, but I think them seeing that your opinion matters and like you matter in general.
Right.
I think that comes with peer-to-peer interaction, because an adult can tell a child to go to a leadership group, but like if you don't feel accepted like among that group of students.
How do you get on the leadership group?
Well, the thing I was gonna add,
group.
well, the thing I was gonna add is sometimes we preclude kids, you know, like everything, you know, we have all these services for our best and brightest kids, you know what I mean? They get all of these things. And so, and we take away opportunities from probably the kids that need it the most. Like if you're not academically, you know, on track, you're not gonna be in sports. You know, where that kid would probably benefit the most from being around other kids that, you know, had goals and, you know what I mean? And so our probably most at-risk kids have the least opportunies, some of which we impose on them. We say, you can't do
But on the
this.
flip side of that, the year we implemented Oveas, and we did the teen, or the student leadership piece of that, they were big on get every kid from every walk of life. So you want the kids that stand up for others, you want the bullies, you want the victims. That was not a good mix at all. Like, we had a really hard time keeping just the discipline of that group under wraps, because you had the kids that were the riskier behaviors, and we spent most of the time focusing on that and keeping them under wraps than the purpose of the group. So I think, I agree with you, but
What
then.
age were
but
those
then-
kids that you were working with, just out of curiosity?
7th and 8th graders, yeah.
So does it start that?
So maybe you need to get it younger?
I was gonna say, so what skills did we impart into those kids before we threw them in that group? Because they're already coming in feeling like they're, you know what I mean, they have something to prove. You know what I mean? Like, so.
I mean, they all went through this 3-day training session together from the Oveas trainer. But just as the group went along, and she did want a lot, so we had like 50 kids in this group, which was a lot. And we found that sometimes in certain situations, it's a little difficult to have such a mixed bag, you know, but, I mean, I'm just playing devil's advocate. I'm all for
There's
kids
no
that
easy
have-
solution. I'm
Yeah,
just saying
yeah.
that sometimes our kids that need it the most. I mean, I think about our kids at the youth center. We've made all kinds of concessions, you know, to, you know, even if just so they can go and participate in, you know, lifting with the rest of the team, even though, I mean, just to give them something to look forward to.
Right.
And I think it's all about how you present what you're doing too. If it's a common goal that they want to see achieved versus saying, hey, you have to do this because this is required by the law, the state, and so you're going to be on this team, it's more of a, which is how I approach sleep, because I asked you, how do you recruit? Like our leader, like the leadership groups that I do, the youth-led stuff, it is, if you want to make a change in your school, come on in. I do not care about your grades, I do not care about your discipline, I don't care where you come from. Obviously, we say it in a very nice professional way, but but that's how we do, and they all are there because they want to make a change together, and it doesn't matter what walk of life they're from. You know, there's multiple different students in that group, but they're all there for the same thing that they want to create change for. And so it's...
So part of the value and the beauty of this group, and we talked about this is today, in 3 hours, we can't do all of this work, but we can begin to project where you go next, right? You've created your foundation. Now we can project where you go next. I like to call what you're doing right here a learning conversation, right? Where you just kind of put it out there on the table and you beat it up and bat it around. Question is, how do we connect our highest risk youth to prevention programs? We've had some successes, we've had some challenges. Is there a way that we can agree across systems that we can adopt some common practices? First of all, a strategic intent to connect our highest risk kids to prevention programs. That's an agreement, right? Secondly, then we have to figure out what are some best practices for how to do that, knowing that we've had some successes and some failures. For me, I call that a partnership, a kind of learning conversation, where we're just gonna beat it up. Somebody's gonna stand up here without saying a word and take some notes and track the conversation, so that at the end we can say, this is where we landed. Now, let's move it forward, so when we come back together next month, we can begin to talk about, based on our conversation, here are some common approaches. How do we take that back to our own systems and our own institutions? Do you see what I'm saying? So that we can begin to see some shifts and some changes. We can't just go out there willy-nilly and start doing stuff. But there's enough expertise around this table to be able to understand it based on past experience and based on data to begin to make some changes. And I'm not talking 5 years down the road when you've perfected it and you've got a grant to do it. I'm talking in 2 months, we can understand it and begin to implement some practices. We might all agree that between now and 60 days from now, each of the systems is going to connect 3 of your most needy kids, or those that are relevant, because some have serious behavioral problems, but 3 kids strategically to prevention program opportunities, whether it's skill building, leadership, self-efficacy, whatever it is. And then we're going to come back at the end of those 60 days and talk about what worked and what didn't work. And based on what worked and what didn't work, we're going to modify it even a little bit further. And these are quick learning conversations that keep the process moving. And it keeps us from being 5 years down the road and we're still talking about what does our picture look like, but we haven't started doing anything yet. Does that make sense? Does that make sense? And as much as I'd love to do all of that today, I can't, because we gotta just kind of create the foundation for where do you go next. That's all we get to do in 3 hours. You had your hand raised. I'm sorry.
No, you're fine. No, you're fine. It wasn't that important.
Okay. So if you remember, raise your hand again. I promise I'll call you right over.
Thanks.
All right. So we've identified some things that even just out of this conversation. I want to go back to, I believe Kaylee, is that your name?
Yes.
That Kaylee said that in the planning, in this picture up here, we need to make sure that youth have as much information as adults. That kids need to understand what they're doing to each other. And if I might share a very, I believe, relevant example. It was my daughter's 13th birthday, and I had her and 6 of her friends. I'm trying to think how many seats I have in the car. The car was full. 6 of her friends, and they're 8th graders from a very small suburban private school. And one of the girls said, Mrs. Molina, can I show you a picture, or will that distract you while you're driving? Which I thought was good, because my kids know my rules about distracted driving. But anyway, I said, no, go ahead, let me see what you have. So she shows me a picture, and I don't know anything about the person in this picture except for this part of their body. Those girls had zoomed in to this part of their body. And they were talking about, oh my God, look at that fat. I'm like, dude, you have this conversation in my car? But anyway, I'm talking about this part of the body, and I have no idea who they're talking about. So I'm like, okay, well, who is that? They said who it was and whatever. So she pulls back into the back seat, and she's like, and she's the most popular girl in the class. Everybody loves her. Everybody wants to be her. And she says, okay, well, now who else is fat can we obsess over? I almost had to pull the car over and have a teachable moment right there on the side of the road. But to your point, Kaylee, these 8th graders, who will soon be freshmen and sophomores and juniors in high school, had no idea, not only their examination of the person in the picture, but I saw the interpretation for my daughter. So that every time I post a picture, I have to look at it and examine, it gives me cold chills, every single square inch. Because I know that people out there are zooming in to everything about that picture. And what that means for her in her self-criticism. What her friend Kirsten, who she started that, would she want to do that to Claudia? She probably would be in tears if she realized that that's what was happening. And I would guess that it wasn't just my daughter Claudia, but the other 6 girls that were in the car, and probably her as well, who was thinking, everybody is examining me this way. right? So I don't think that young people have an understanding of what they're doing and the impact that it's having on the people around them. It's just innocent fun, right?
Or themselves, you have to tell the second part of the story, when you went to buy the outfit. A week later.
Right. So I took that same daughter to the store to buy an outfit to go to the school social. And she was crying in the dressing room because she couldn't find anything that she felt great in. Now, mind you, I realized that she had her phone and she's taking pictures of herself in the mirror and the outfits that she likes and doesn't like. Took the phone away. Took the phone away, got her crying outside of the dressing room. We picked something out and she puts on this outfit. And I can tell when she comes out of the room by the way her eyes are lighting up and the genuine smile on her face, those of you who are parents, you know it, that she is in love with this outfit. It is a beautiful outfit. She looks fantastic in this outfit. She's so excited because now she has something to buy to the social, wear to the social, to the dance. So I'm like, hurry up, let's pay for it before you change your mind and let's get out of here, right? So we go home and she comes downstairs to go to the dance and she's not wearing the outfit. Claudia, where's the outfit I just paid for? We spent 3 hours buying it. I decided I didn't like it. It didn't look good on me. And just like even the look and the light in her eyes and in her face, she refused to wear the outfit. I said, you took a picture of yourself in it, didn't you? And she said, yes. I said, you shared it with your friends, didn't you? And she said, yes. I said, they didn't like it, did they? And she's like, I don't know. So there was this whole 1 hour interaction where she was examining it herself, sharing it with her friends, that resulted in her not wearing the outfit. She wore something that she did not feel good about because her eyes were not lit up when she left the house. Now I share that as a parent because I think it's really relevant to the work that you're doing and incredibly relevant to the point that you made. That parents need to understand the impact of social media, but I think we have some work to do with young people, right? How do we provide positive and supportive feedback through social media outlets versus criticism? Why are we not zooming into pictures to talk about how beautiful your hair is? I stand behind you. Instead of saying, oh my God, look at that haircut, one side's longer than the other, by like a 1,000th of a millimeter. But I know that because I zoomed in, right? So how do we build those skills? Not only provide the information, but build those skills in young people as well. Again, if we build a picture like this one, and we know that we want to, and we talk as a group, not about youth successfully navigate social media, because that's too big. It's too broad. It's like saying we're going to eradicate the world of rats. Like, it's too big. We don't know how to do it. But when we start talking about parents and youth understand the impact of social media on mental health, we can now begin to think about what are we going to do? How do we do that? How do we achieve that? Versus let's take on the monster of social media. Let's break it down into some of the parts and the pieces. And we can either look at new and innovative programs and approaches, or we can say, what are we already doing where we can build this in? If we have programs in our school that are talking about self-image, about self-efficacy, about goals in the future, Girl Scouts, mentoring, Boys and Girls Club, all of these entities that already exist, imagine if we use those opportunities that exist, those relationships that are trusted by our kids, those program providers that are already funded to do it, to start building these pieces in. Instead of saying, oh, we've got to get money, we've got to do a program, we've got to get parents, we've got to get kids to come. How can we build it into what already exists? Does that make sense? So, part of your work is inventorying and understanding how do we achieve these short-term objectives through the lens of the yellow box. The second part of your work that you have to do is just like we did with youth mental health before we got off the conversation, off the topic a little bit, was we started asking, how do we measure youth mental health? And we discovered that we have some data out there. We just have to access it and compile it to begin to understand how do we measure it. Because we have to be able to know in 12 months, 24 months, whether or not we're having a positive impact on youth mental health. You can use the asset survey and look at the support and the positive identity care category. Those are indicators of youth mental health. But I don't like to say that first because I think you have other places that are more relevant and more quickly accessible, like your counselors, right? Like your youth workers. for logging in youth cases, those sorts of things, to measure youth mental health. Then we have to ask, how do we measure whether or not youth are successfully navigating social media? How do we measure that? Any ideas?
Well, in my world, it's how many issues I have to deal with social media in a day, because I deal with them, I'm sure you do, like, it deals with it just about every day. So I would say decrease of reported problems with it is one way, maybe.
Yeah, I believe that parents understanding that they have some part to play in the social media problem, because every time I call a parent about social media, they want me to, why don't you put it into Instagram? I can't do that.
Even though
You're the parent.
Yeah.
I mean, that's, honest to God, I had that, why don't you stop it? I don't really know how I'm supposed to stop it.
Has anybody heard of private stories? It's the new Snapchat update. Oh, yeah. No, I just think that it makes it even harder because there are so many ways that social media is introducing a way that you can tailor your audience. Like, I might not want to post something on my whole entire story for everybody to see, but there's an inappropriate behavior that I want to post that I only show to my friends.
I tripped
You
into
know what I
that
mean?
over
Like,
pictures.
What
Because
is
it's a
it?
convenient way to
Yeah.
hide pictures you don't want the world to see, but
Yeah.
you want certain people to see, and it,
But even with like Twitter and Instagram, there are ways to like tailor it so only the people you want to see are seeing what you're posting.
Well, how is that different on Snapchat? Then it stays, like a private story, the pictures will stay in the story?
No, they disappear after 24 hours, or until you delete them.
and there's
Oh,
also
like-
the For My Eyes Only folder.
Yeah,
Right.
but do you know how like stories work where you put it up and then all of your friends can see it?
Right.
You can make another story where only 5 of your friends can see it,
Right.
instead of like
Yes.
your parents.
I
who
guess
have
I
it
thought
on
that was
there.
already.
I hear about my private story a lot.
Yeah, no, that's new.
So, again, and I'm paying
So glad my kids are grown.
very close attention to time, because a minute ago I thought we had till 11:30, and I quickly realized we have until 10:30. So trying to pay attention to time and make sure that we end in a valuable space. There's value to that conversation around this table. I, as a parent, know how quickly it's moving. I don't even have enough storage in my phone to keep up with all the apps that my kids can keep up with, right? Let alone learn them myself and then figure out how to monitor it. Like, it's beyond my capacity. So if that's the reality around the table of parents in Geauga County, you have an opportunity to have a learning discussion and figure out what can we do about that. I don't know what the data is at this point, but we gotta be close to 97, 98% of people in mainstream America have a mobile device, right? Everybody's got a phone. I'm looking at y'all because Geauga County's a little more rural, and I don't know if everybody's got a phone, right?
No, even the Amish have.
Right?
They do.
They do.
I just
Working at a Catholic school and the nun pulled hers out, so I know everybody's got one, right? So
They're flip phones.
how do we use that to our advantage, right? And I use the example of parent monitoring social media. I might follow you on Twitter if you gave me something that was valuable and necessary. And so once a week or every week you're saying, Snapchat modified, they could do private stories, here's how you check it. I want to know that. I don't want to keep coming out to parent meetings that happen once every 6 months or once a year when the changes on my kids' phones are happening once a week or once a month, right? That's how quickly it's changing and updating and new apps and new ways to get around things. So is there an opportunity to combine some of the media resources with your publicly funded providers as well as the school district to do something that utilizes the strengths? Mobile devices is a strength in some ways to achieve the goals that you're trying to achieve. Because a lot of times we'll think, okay, parents need to understand the impact of social media. Let's convene them. We don't have to. Because we have ways to share the information in a way that's relevant. Or, even sending out a message that says, okay, how did this make you feel? Would you like it? Well, that's how your kids feel. You know, there's creative ways to do this instead of saying, look at this PowerPoint and learn this information. But we have to pool resources and do that and begin to build something across the county, and that's the power of what you all have here. Somebody had their hand raised. Oh, I promised you I would call on you and you didn't. I'm so sorry. Yes.
So I don't know if this is an update or not, but I know Apple does it. So on Sunday, I get like a weekly screen time alert, and I go on it, and it tells me how many hours I was on my phone a day, what I used it for. So there's like different sections. There's like entertainment, connecting, just like all. They have a bunch of categories.
You can edit
Yeah,
it to what you
can-
wanna see.
Yeah, and then you can click on like a piece of like, so you'll have your day, and then you can click on a piece of like the hours, and it'll tell you, and it'll highlight what you spent most, and then it also tells you what app you spend the most time on. So I think that might help with like data, and I think that's an easy thing, like it's accessible.
Absolutely. Swear, not gonna lie, in the car with my children, and they're having a conversation just Sunday, must have been Saturday, because it was more than a couple days ago, about exactly what you're talking about. And my 12-year-old daughter, she wouldn't share all her weaknesses with you, but I think it's so important to the work that we're doing. My 12-year-old daughter said, Izzy told me that her best friend, Izzy told me that she spent 68 hours on FaceTime. Claudia, who's in the front seat, my 13-year-old, does the calculation. She's like, that's 2.5 days. And Natalie said, and only 3.5 hours was with me. I'm like, oh my God, here we go again, right? So as much as it is a tool, the interpretation on a 12-year-old, I swear to God, that's a conversation we just had in the car. I listened as they talked, and I'm taking notes on how to be a parent in this social media day and age. So, but anyway, the point is, we have to have data, right? We gotta be able to measure what it is that we're doing. And some of that measurement can start when we do the inventory of programs, services, and supports. When we ask the question, who's working towards youth mental health? What are the measurements, what are the outcomes they're trying to achieve, and what data do they have available? How do we measure youth successfully navigating social media? And how do we measure whether or not youth are supported during times of transition? And that there is data that is available and readily available in your community. We just have to have the learning conversations. When you come back to your meeting next month, you say, we want youth to have a positive sense of self, self-efficacy, and sense of purpose. How do we measure that? What data do we have available? And you take on 2 or 3 of those a month until you create some data space to be able to answer those questions. At the same time, you can begin saying, through the yellow lens, what are we going to do to achieve that? You don't have to wait 8 months to start doing this. You can start talking about, if we want parents and youth to have information about social media, what do we need to do it? Do we need a new program, or do we need to figure out how to build it into programs that we already do? How does it present itself in the school? What kind of feedback pushback are you getting from parents? How does social media impact the lives of young people? You all have that information. And you can sit and have the conversation, document your conversation so it becomes data. You can have the conversation and then begin to talk about how are we going to respond. But first we gotta move out of data collection, begin to draw a picture. Person who gathers the most data does not win the prize. You do not get a prize because you have so much data in your trunk that your bumper hits the back of the road, right? Now we have a little bit more of a focus about what is the data we're trying to collect. We did the big data collection. We drew some conclusions. We need to dig a little deeper and at the same time begin to think about how are we going to respond through the yellow box. Questions? Comments? Concerns? Yes?
So you said we've done our big data, don't get too heavy with data collection. So what would you suggest for each of those as indicators? If we have the Google form that measures the number of visits for anxiety and depression that all guidance counselors might use, is that one benchmark enough? Because if you say each one needs 3 or 4 benchmarks, that's a lot of data. What do you
Yes.
suggest?
I don't know that I said each one needs 3 or 4 benchmarks, because I don't want you to start to be stifled before you ever start, right? So don't get so overwhelmed by the number. You have to have at least one measurement for each of the boxes on your logic model. You have to have at least one.
But you might have 3 or 4 strategies aimed at that.
That makes sense, because that's a comprehensiveness. All right,
Yes.
got it.
Now, you may have more, but you don't have to have more.
Okay.
Most often what happens is as the group's work elevates and becomes more complex and sophisticated, those will become naturally apparent, what those other measurements need to be. My recommendation is figure out one for each and begin to move forward, knowing, somebody said earlier, as complex as the issues our youth face are, as complex as they are alive and moving constantly, right? So this group has to be alive and moving constantly. New things are gonna emerge, new priorities, new data, new learnings, all of that sort of thing. Starting with one, understanding that it's gonna grow and become more complex.
Great.
What are your categories? I'm curious because honestly, unfortunately, guidance counselors seem to be the window of the school, like to track all of, you know what I mean, like all of these, you know.
I
who's
keep
having-
adding more categories, but I just shared it with Karen and with my.
And then, and do you track how many instances or how many kids?
So, if I were to print it all at the, so I print it all at the end of the year because it has my anecdotal notes on it too. And then, but if I wanna, because it's in a Google form, if I wanna look at the data, it'll print it in like, just the check boxes I'm doing, it'll print it in like a graph or something. So, hold on, let me find it.
We started doing this in November. Brittany and I tracked our hours and then it just kind of fell off because it was so hard to like
I stopped
jump from,
doing,
I would
like-
forget to do it all day and
I
then
know,
you're like,
I
oh my God,
stopped
I didn't
doing like
track
my
any of my
meetings and
hours.
stuff, cause I take notes on those during, but like
Yeah.
if it's my one-on-one contact. So I track what time of day I'm seeing kids, like if it's the period of the day, male or female, their grade, how long it took, so like in 15-minute increments basically. Who was the referral, was it, and these are all just check boxes, boom, boom, boom. Like was it the student themselves, was it the parents, was it myself, the administrator, the teacher? And then the reasons I have, but I'm always adding to them, are academic, anger, attendance, anxiety and depression, bullying, career, future planning, wish I didn't mark that one, check-in, decision-making responsibility, 504, friendship or peer issues, grief, health or hygiene, home and family, new student, organization, scheduling, self-harm, sexual harassment, social media, social issues,
She's really
teacher
broken down.
concern.
Wow.
You have it really broken down.
I have other.
Yeah.
Welcome to the high school.
Well, and I have another because then I still have some that don't fit into this category.
Do you have what the heck on there? Because that's where most of mine would fall, because these guys are doing triage daily, and I get the overflow. I've had more crying girls over some silly boy that has no idea that they exist
Yep.
than I've had in the last 3
That
months.
usually falls under friendship or peer issues.
Yeah, that would be, all girls would be mentally ill.
If I had a drama category, that would be
Right?
Well, the reason I ask is I'm just wondering how we track, I literally, I'm studying about how you track the, you know, what we measure for social media. Like, how are we going to measure any impact? You know what I mean, like.
I think we have to define the problem. I know we all know what the problem is, but I think we have to define what
That's what
actually,
I'm saying.
I don't know, it's very still, as broken down as it is there, it's still very broad, and that's where I came back to my story with the parent who wanted me to shut down Instagram. I don't know how we.
I would love to, and I don't know like how well this would go over, but I mean, we've talked about this at Berkshire about you know, removing the phones during the school day, having the kids just keep them in their lockers all school day. So I don't know if they're like, I don't know if we'd get parent support, but I know teachers are really craving that.
We did that at like I said, we did that at Twinsburg for 2 years. My entire life was phone battles.
I'm just gonna say
And
that.
the majority of it was with the parents.
Yep, well, that's what I have right now. The kids are not allowed to have the phones in class.
In class.
They're in their lockers.
So like lunchtime.
We allow them at lunchtime. But because the rule said, I mean, I could, at this point, every kid in the school could be, if I wanted to go this route, either detention or up to suspension, because they all have their phones in class, even though the rule clearly says. So the next step we took is we got those things that hang on the door.
And they put their phones in when they walk in.
Yeah.
That seems to be working a little bit better, but still,
Teacher level.
But
at the
I
teacher
see
level, but
that-
still, kids can.
They have it around the hallways, they have.
Yeah, they can hide them wherever, and really, it's a battle. I've fought that battle for 2 years with parents mainly.
But I don't think it's the solution anyway, because I see that, and let me know if I'm wrong, as an Arcan example. Just because we take that phone away, we are doing nothing to help them
Well, I
successfully.
agree with you 100%.
right?
And the other
Okay.
thing that I have as a kid, more than one kid, but I call this kid he's, whenever I have a computer problem, I don't call our tech guy, I call a kid. He's a 5th grader. He is.
He's crazy.
But I took,
David,
I took away his phone. I mean, it was on my desk.
He's got the back.
And he got the Chromebook out and somehow went around something, somewhere, somehow, and I don't know what he did, but he was texting. So it didn't matter, he was on Snapchat, it didn't matter that the phone was gone.
At our level, at the high school level, kids always have, they get new phones every other week, and so they always keep their old phone, and so they turn in their old phone that's not
Yes.
even like logged in.
Oh
And
my
then they have their active phone in their.
Yeah, any of our posts.
All of them, the high school kids do,
It
they
is.
turn in their bad phones. And
They probably buy one off of eBay to turn in.
They do, some have.
A million of them.
Well, so, Karen's example, it's like the drug problem, you can't address it after the fact, that's too late.
But I think the relevance, and to Karen's point, is that we can't fall off the cliff like the Narcan example. We have to keep coming back to, what do we need to be doing? What do we need to be doing? What do we need to be doing? And we have to go across the context and across the categories. We can't just intervene at one level with boundaries. Because that doesn't, taking away Instagram doesn't do anything because they're gonna replace it with Snapchat.
Right, exactly.
Right? So it's our responsibility to teach responsible use because it is the reality of their world today, right? So we gotta consider all of these types of things. But I don't wanna diminish the value and the importance of your question of how do we measure, right?
I mean, in any way, shape, or form.
And we have opportunities. We have to get innovative about how we collect that data. For example, if we have 6 different questions that we want to ask kids about what's the impact of social media, and you could spend 15 minutes in your meeting deciding what are those 6 questions that we want to ask about social media. Do you regulate screen time? Who taught you how to regulate screen time? How much time do you spend on screen? I don't know, whatever they are. And then those questions can be asked by a school-wide survey. It can be asked by the health teacher. Of every kid who comes to health class, it can be asked by the coaches. It can be asked by, however it is to get and gather that information. We just have to document it and do it again in a predictable way, in a predictable time frame. So if we're gonna ask every kid who comes to the local grocery store, I'm talking really innovative, these 6 questions, and we give them a $2 coupon in the store, whatever, I don't know. Communities have tried crazy things and it works. To get kids to answer those 6 questions that help us measure this, and then we have to predict that we're gonna go to that same grocery store 12 months from now and ask the first 35 kids that come through the door these questions. So it's that predictable data collection pattern, but it doesn't have to be a formal survey. There are ideal ways, and then there is community research, right? And we gotta do more and better of that community research. My last piece of input, because we're at our time break. All of these green boxes are very difficult to measure and may not be the perfect words. You'll develop that over time. But we may be able to design a series of questions. Maybe we pull question number 16 and 18 off of the asset development survey, and we couple that with question number 24 and 25 from the Communities That Care survey, and we add in 4 of our newly drafted social media questions, and we end up with 10. Remember the meeting of providers who provide programs in schools that we talked about is so important? Maybe one of the requirements is not that you train your staff how to build relationships with kids, but it is mandatory that you ask these 10 questions at the conclusion of every one of your programs, right? So it gives you data not just about the social media piece, but also about some of the other measurements that you want to have. that keeps us out of some of the cloudy space of a formal survey as well, where parents get a little nervous, right? Instead of adding, where we can add it into other program evaluation pieces. We can even add it to follow your daughter's schedule night and get some information from parents. Or at the conclusion of our fall sports parent meetings. Or at the request of the coach. You know, there are ways for us to gather this information. And the only way that I have seen communities be successful in doing it is when you have a collective group together who has a shared urgency for change. And that urgency for change for you all is, I heard you say it at the beginning, I had 2 kids die by suicide. I had 2 kids die by suicide. We have too many kids who are thinking about suicide. We have too many kids who are suffering from depression and anxiety. You all said it at the beginning. You have a shared urgency to act. You agree we got to do something. Then you have to have a shared urgency for change. That means that you have to recognize and acknowledge that what we're doing is insufficient. We got to do it a little bit differently than the way we've been doing it. The world is moving fast. The world has changed from when we first designed our approach. We got to do a little bit of a redesign, right? So you got to have a shared agreement that something has to happen. We have to do something. It has to be done urgently. We can't wait 10 years. And then the third thing that is critical is we have shared accountability. We agree that success and failure is collective. It's not anybody's job here to do it all by themselves. It's our job collectively. And if we succeed, we all win. And if we fail or are challenged, then we all have to come back to the drawing board and figure out how to do it again, right? That's your challenge. Now, in 3 hours, I'd love to say that we're going to get all the way from start to finish and all of this work, but we can't. It's not enough time. Besides the fact that you all would probably shoot me because, not shoot me, I'm sorry, that was not fair. See, I'm learning. You would throw me out of the rooms or throw tomatoes at me or pineapples from the back of the room. Because you're tired. Your brains are tired and fatigued. I've presented new information in new ways. Sometimes we've got to walk away and let that sink in. But one of the things that I hope we did do today was create a foundation for the work that lies ahead for you all, that keeps you moving in a direction to meet the needs of young people in new and innovative ways. Not just doing the programs the way we've always done them, but let's think a little outside the box to get to new spaces and new outcomes, right? Any questions? Sorry. I never go over and I went over. It was the fire alarm.
It was Andy's question.
Most things are, so it's all good. I'm used to it.
Hopefully, I don't know, will I see these folks again this afternoon, or is it a whole new group of people?
It should be a new group of people, just for you guys, in case it wasn't clear. This information is going to be repeated this afternoon.